Hi, everybody. We have a very exciting episode today. We have Brendan Moorehead, who has put together an Eat4 Earth event. It's a little bit of a longer episode, but I know you're going to find it super fascinating. And keep ready for that word, fascinating and fun. It is a lot of science, but it's really understanding that the earth we live on is regenerative, as is our body, and that it is not fateful what is going on. We do not have to be oh gosh, there's no more good food on the planet, because that is not true. And Brendan Moorehead is here to explain to you how we can accomplish that, how we can work together, and also give you access to more information for free than even you have right here. Do listen to the end. It's a great episode, even if you have to break it up. I know it's a little bit longer, but thank you all for listening. We really appreciate it. And we are so looking forward to understanding the Eat4 Earth event and why this wonderful Stanford graduate biologist and I became fast friends and fascinated at the science that we both do. Talk to you soon. Welcome back to the Beats with Kelly Kennedy, and I'm very excited because my new friend Brendan Moorehead and I had a podcast for his Eat4 Earth a month ago or so, and it literally just, we could not stop talking. I felt like, oh my gosh, these two science geeks got together and outpoured all this wisdom from him, and I wanted to be able to introduce all of you to him and his Eat for Life agenda, and he's got some other things that I think he's working on, because he is one of the prominence, as far as I'm concerned, truly educating people about how the body works and how we need to live on this planet as a human organism. So thank you so much for joining us today, Brendan. And tell us a little bit about how the Eat4 Earth project started. But I do want to say that he is a brilliant biologist and environmental engineer, and he went to Stanford. So he's now dummy. So welcome, Brendan.
Thank you. So yeah, Eat4 Earth has actually was in a way it was born 34 years ago. So when I was just getting interested in sustainable agriculture in college, and at the same time I was losing my health actually from a number of things that happened when I was a teenager. So when I was 15, I had three courses of tetracycline, which is enough to wipe out anybody's microbiome and make sure it doesn't come back. Um, and and we didn't know anything, right? Nobody really talked about probiotics back then, and so that was the beginning. And my health basically crashed at a point where I was getting more and more interested in what we were referring to as sustainable agriculture back then. So I went through this long period of chronic fatigue and so forth, and it really interrupted that trajectory. But then as I started to get my health back, I started to pick up on the thread of what was starting to be called regenerative agriculture, and saw some podcasts and some, TED Talks. So the TED Talk in 2013 by Alan Savory was kind of life changing for me, because I had gone through a whole period where I became vegetarian. I was trying to be vegan. I had, I understood that that rainforests were being, cut down in part to make way for cattle, although it's a lot more complicated than that. And you can't simplify it to that degree, even back then, because usually there's a succession. Usually they come in and they do some mining, and then they come in and they, take the trees, and then they turn it over to other people to do, slash and burn agriculture. That's usually not the first step in the Amazon, but sometimes it is. Anyway, and now they're clearing forests for soy, which is, corn, mainly soy that's going into animal feed, but actually most of the soy goes to chicken and pork, not cattle. So there's a lot of complexity there. In any case, I went whole hog into vegetarianism and veganism, and I really thought that was important to save the planet. That was the main reason I went into it. And then along comes this TED Talk by Alan Savory in 2013, and I had recovered maybe 60-70% of my health at that point, and was interested in, picking up the thread again with something to do with regenerative, with what I was thinking of as sustainable agriculture. And then I started to learn that regenerative is really the term we should be using now, as far as going to the next level, because we don't want to just sustain what's not really working that well. We need to actually totally regenerate the planet. And it turns out that this relationship between biodiverse plant communities and biodiverse soil organism communities is at the foundation of all of life on Earth, including in the oceans. I mean, there's this dynamic interplay. And so as I was learning all of this, as far as, okay, we can restore grasslands, we can draw carbon out of the atmosphere and out of the oceans, and all these different threads started coming together, starting with that TED talk I saw by Alan Savory. I'm going to keep mentioning his name because people need to check it out. If you haven't yet, it's already got 4 million views or something, and read his book, Holistic Management, the 3rd edition. That will just totally transform your paradigm about ecology, especially in what he calls brittle environments. It's a really key term. And I'm tending to dive down the rabbit hole right here, so I want to try to bring it back. But that was basically how I started to get interested in regenerative agriculture, and realizing that that was also a key to restoring the nutritional integrity of our food supply. I didn't actually realize until I started to look into it just how depleted our food is. And I was thinking, wow, no wonder I'm having a hard time, getting my health back, because, back in the 70s, there were a lot of people doing, raw food and juicing and this and that, and they were healing all kinds of stuff with, 10 pounds of fresh produce juiced every day. Well, now it's like you got to do 25 pounds or something at these clinics that have that particular focus as far as healing cancer and so forth. But so I found out, okay, wow, regenerative agriculture can actually restore the it's roughly 90% of the minerals that have been lost from our food supply. So we're living on, 10% of the minerals, maybe a little more on average, because some have not been depleted that far, but certain minerals like copper are down to 10, 15% of what they were in our food supply 100 years ago. And so I decided to bring these two things together, how regenerative agriculture can restore our food and our health and regenerate the planet.
So it's very similar to the concept of the milieu therapy, the terrain therapy, and biological medicine from a health perspective that I studied in Europe, where they were on my own journey, right? But to figure out that if you change the internal environment, then the cells in the space, the space is the terrain and the cells are in the space. If you change the terrain, the environment, the cells will behave better. And essentially what you're saying is, if we change how we're farming so that we're not depleting, but it's regenerating itself and supporting itself, it'll not only add benefit to the soil, but it'll also regenerate and make the food more nutritional, correct?
Yeah.
Did I understand that right?
Yeah, well, the way plants get minerals from the soil is they're essentially mined from the soil by the microbes and delivered to the root. And that happens in several ways. And so there's an interview with Elaine Ingham, PhD, in the Eat4 Earth event, where she explains the soil food web, which is a concept that she co-pioneered, I think it was back in the 80s. So soil food web with, capital letters, because it's a proper noun. It's a thing. And her whole business is based on that. She's a soil health consultant and a researcher. So all her research is based on that. And
so if you have a proper microbiome in the soil, it'll allow the root of whatever the food that's growing to pull from the soil the minerals and everything it needs to feed the plant, so it has the nutritional content. Is that?
Yeah. As one example, there's a type of fungus called mycorrhizal fungi.
Okay.
Whatever.
He's a fun guy no matter what. Yes, like you.
And so one type of this fungus organism will actually puts like a hyphae into the plant root, and the plant allows it. Certain species of plants, most of them allow this. Certain species of plants do not associate with mycorrhizal fungi, but most do. And the fungal organism has a much broader network of hyphae that go out into the soil. Plus, it has a huge genome with all kinds of tricks as far as producing enzymes and acids and so forth to grab the minerals from the sand, silt, and clay in the soil. And so it's basically dissolving that stuff out of the parent material, and and it's also, some of the minerals are bound up in the organic matter and so forth. So the fungal organism can pull this stuff into its body and then put some of it into the plant's root. And the plant will actually communicate with the fungal organism by giving it sugars and amino acids and so forth. But it's barter. It's a barter system. So this
So
system,
interesting.
yeah.
So interesting.
What's interesting about conventional agriculture is because we keep putting on, potassium, NPK, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, the plants start to depend less and less on the mycorrhizal fungi, and then they even stop associating with mycorrhizal fungi, and you don't get all the trace minerals coming into the plants at the same level, because you got just the three growth limiting nutrients are the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. So you can grow green plants with that, but they're not going to be mineral dense at all.
So in commercial farming, essentially, that's what they're using versus the regenerative farming. They're using this, and this is a naturally occurring fungal species, right? That's naturally occurring in the soil, or do they add it to the soil? I don't quite understand that.
Well, if it's missing from the soil, you can add it. Yeah, that's one of the things that sometimes happens when people are transitioning from really dead soil back to a healthier soil. You can bring in mycorrhizal fungi.
Okay, so you can supplement it, or you can have it just created by the process of this regenerative farming that'll continue to get created.
But yeah, I mean, if there's any of it left in the soil, you can kind of goose the biology through various methods to have it come back to life. Have the populations come back of the mycorrhizal fungi, but you can also jumpstart it by bringing in basically a probiotic for the soil that includes mycorrhizal fungi.
And so that translated for you at that point, you were a vegan vegetarian, you're eating about 70%, or you were 70% better. Then you saw this podcast, or the TED Talk rather, with Alan Savory.
Mm-hmm.
Savory. Kind of read my own writing as I look down. Alan Savory. And then what happened? Did you change how you were eating after that TED Talk?
Already changed. This was quite some time after I'd started adding meat back in my diet. So I had been I didn't last long vegan, but I was vegetarian for about 8 years. The vegan episodes were, no longer than a few weeks at a time. And at least I think that's about as long as they were. But in about, I think it was 1997 or 1998, I don't even know how this, I was talking to somebody on the phone. She was like an energy healer or a massage therapist or something. I don't know. I don't even think we had met. And she said, out of the blue, she said, "You need to be eating meat again." I'm like, "What?" It was just some reading she gave me. I'm like, "Yeah, you need to eat meat." I'm like, "Okay." So I started to eat meat again, and it was actually hard to kind of jumpstart my digestion of meat again. But when I had it, I was like, "Oh my God, I've really been missing something." Because it was, my body was telling me, "Oh my God, I need this." As far as my taste buds were telling me that. My stomach was saying, "I don't know if I can digest this." So it took a while to come back. And there is a mechanism by which a high carb diet will actually reduce, a high carb, low protein diet will actually reduce stomach acid production. So I kind of hypothesized that if you do that for a long time, you're down regulating your stomach acid production. It's not to say you can't get it back, but it can be a process. And that's a challenge for a lot of people who've been a vegan for a while, or just vegetarian, because
I did the same thing. I was a vegetarian for 10 years, and then one weekend I had a mentor of mine put meat in my mouth, and I basically ate meat 3 days in a row. And thank God there was an acupuncturist on that trip who basically salvaged me, because my digestion was like, "Are you kidding me?" Because I had enough stomach acid to break all that meat down, essentially.
Right.
But I did, and that was their point, that I wasn't feeling well enough. I wasn't having enough vigor. I didn't have enough life force. And I'm not a huge animal protein eater at all. My husband calls me a reluctant carnivore. Like, I eat it because I know that I need it at times and it makes me feel better, but I don't love it. So I always make sure that I buy meat at a local farm who does regenerative farming and make sure that it's like high quality and the animal felt love and ate good things. And, you know, I'm that person that cares about how my animal felt, because I've slaughtered animals and I know what that's like. I was raised, you know, I went to agricultural school at Cornell. I've done that, and it's not a pleasant experience. And if you aren't mindful of when you're doing it, it can really change it. So anyway, that's a whole sidetrack. Tell me about Eat for Earth. So that started your journey, the TED Talk.
Mhm.
How did it translate into Eat for Earth?
Well,
I mean,
I just kind of had this idea.
Eat for Earth.
Yeah, Eat for Earth. I had, just had this vision of putting together an interview series of people on the health side and on the agricultural side, and just started reaching out to people. I started going to conferences, enlisting people to speak in the event, and just from person to person, got people. A lot of people liked the idea. When I would
Yeah.
describe it, they were like, "Oh yeah, that sounds awesome." It's like, we need to be doing this.
Yeah.
So
And so in my world, people come to us all the time and they think that because we claim that we're nutritional something or other, I don't even know what we called ourselves for years. And I just call myself a biological investigator, but nutrition's a tough subject. Talk to the reluctant carnivore over here that was a vegetarian for a long time. It's a tough subject.
very tough because it's highly bio-individual. There's a lot of biological individuality that goes into it, and a lot of people don't want to hear that, or they're just not intellectually predisposed to it, because I think people, it's probably just a human character trait that we tend to think in polarized ways, like it's either this or it's that. And so it's very easy to get into the idea that because there's so many great things about plant-based foods and a plant-based diet, because there's so many things wrong with conventional factory farming, and I mean, that just has to stop, period. But does that mean that there's no planet healthy way to raise animals? And is there, and then there's the issue of is animal food? I mean, there's evidence that seems to suggest that animal food increases disease risk, but that hasn't been well. Um, but there's a lot of conflation between eating animal foods and eating processed foods, and eating animal foods from a system that's bioaccumulating pesticides and antibiotics and all kinds of stuff into the into the animal products. So when you actually separate those out, and there hasn't been much research on that, but there's certainly research that shows that, or that at least suggests, and I'm not going to be able to quote any here yet, but I don't have that prepared, but that suggests that people that do include meat in their diet can be just as healthy as people who are predominantly vegetarian or even vegan. And there's also some evidence that people who are vegan are actually suffering some nutritional deficiencies and deficits that are impacting their fertility, their ability to have viable offspring, and cognitive performance, things like that can happen. I'm not saying that a vegan diet can't work for some people, but it seems to not work for most. And so there's probably a middle ground, and there's also a continuum. And I'm kind of pulling together the evidence on all of this, everything I can find, because I'm fascinated by bioindividuality, especially in regard to food, nutrition, and diet, because that has become such a divisive arena, and we really need to all come together. All the real food movements need to come together, and and celebrate the fact that we can grow any kind of food in a way that heals the earth. And that's regenerative agriculture, whether you're doing it with animals or without animals. But with animals provides a lot of advantages, as far as, I mean, animals are basically roving composters.
And dense nutrition. Yeah.
There's a lot of nutrient density in the animal meat. So I mean, people can argue back and forth about, well, can you get enough zinc without animal foods? Yeah, you can. And can you get enough iron? Yeah, you can. Some people don't absorb non-heme iron very well, though. And then there's also the issue of what I want to say, fat soluble vitamins. So vitamin A does not exist in the plant kingdom. You've got beta carotene, but a lot of people don't convert beta carotene very well, and you can see this in your genetics. You just get run your SNPs from 23andMe or many other companies, put it through a filter and see if you have the genes to convert beta carotene efficiently into vitamin A or not. But beta carotene is not vitamin A, and yet you see on all the blogs on the internet, they'll tell you there's this much vitamin A in a carrot. There's not a bit of vitamin A in a carrot. And people of certain ancestry do not get much vitamin A from carrots and squash and all the wonderful vegetables that are full of carotenoids. And so those people are going to be more dependent on either a supplement or on eating organ meats or whatever. I mean, that's what human beings used to. I mean, I'm sure some people want to disagree with this, but if you look at human cultures that were, look, Weston Price, who was a dentist, went out there and he looked at cultures in the early 20th century, looked for every single culture that had not been too impacted by industrialization, who were eating a traditional diet that they've been eating for centuries or millennia. And all of them had put a high value on animal products eaten raw that had fat soluble nutrients in them, particularly vitamin K2. He called it X factor at that time. And we're pretty sure that it was vitamin K2 now that we know more about vitamin K2. And how much vitamin K2 is in the plant kingdom? Not much. If you ferment soy into natto, that's a really good source of vitamin K2. It's totally vegan. I am not aware of any other plant sources. Well, in your gut. So gut microbes, if you have a really healthy microbiome, you might be able to get some K2 from that. But there is evidence suggesting that we can't get enough from that. But, I haven't looked at the study cohorts of those research studies. And, do we know those people didn't have dysbiosis? I don't know. If they had been eating a hunter-gatherer diet and they had a super diverse, microbiome, might they have produced enough vitamin K2 from plant foods? Maybe.
So a diverse microbiome, you just said, right? So this is something that I've noticed, that when I go to the regenerative farm, for instance, she has different vegetables, different fruits. She's got, plants for me to eat and flowers, and she's educated me along the way in a lot of ways. And the Pocono Organics has also done a huge shift. I don't know if you're familiar with Poco Organics, but they've made a huge shift into bringing heritage foods back in and working with a larger organization from Germany. I can't think of the name of it right now.
It's like the biodynamic Demeter. Yeah. Demeter is if we're talking about biodynamics, I think they're out of Germany.
Yeah. But it's not biodynamics, but it's like food. The name of their organization is like Food for Farming or Farm Food or something. But it's about the fact that, and I'll look that up and put that in the show notes, but it's about the fact that we don't have enough, like there's 57 types of avocados, yet you walk into Whole Foods, Wegmans, or whatever, and they're all Haas avocados from one source in Mexico or Mission. Good luck, those are your avocados. And it's just, that's also limited our biodiversity, correct? Like the fact that we're commercially farming, and then we're only commercially farming one type of tomato, one type of lettuce, one type of broccoli, one type of zucchini, one type of, listen, I get sick just like everybody else does because I eat mostly vegetables. Broccoli, carrots, zucchini, celery, tomatoes, green beans, asparagus, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower. Tell me another vegetable that everybody's eating all day long. Like, this is it, right? It gets boring. And I love food. I love food. I love to eat, but I get bored with that kind of stuff. And I think then they want to fry it. They want to, we want to do things to make it taste better, to be more exciting. But I think this is two things we've gotten away from, is the diversity in our food, and that what food is really about is to nourish us and to feed us. And I feel like part of the reason that I feel that I want more food and variety in my diet is I'm too conscious at times of like, I'm eating the same broccoli that I've eaten for 5 years. I need a new broccoli. This isn't giving me enough. It feels good. It tastes good, but I just know better that I should have a different type of broccoli and more nutrition, more dense nutrition in there. Can you speak about those subjects a little bit?
Well, sure. Anthropologists tell us that hunter-gatherers, including modern ones, that we can, still find in Africa, New Guinea, and so forth, eating like 250 species of plants every year. It's just, we're eating 25 if we're lucky. It's a phenomenal difference. So we don't have the kind of microbiome they have as far as the diversity. Um, and we're just learning, how much depends on just simply having diversity in your microbiome as far as the health outcomes. And yeah, this is a direct consequence of how we've commercialized the celebrity vegetables. Certain vegetables are now the celebrity of whatever, and it's ridiculous. I want to say one thing about avocados, and I haven't researched this in great detail, but from what I understand, the avocado boom. Excuse me, let me get a drink here.
If he tells me that I can't eat avocados anymore, y'all, I might fall off my chair right now.
Yeah, I'm just not going to publish this podcast.
It's like my staple food. What are you going to tell me? I'm bracing myself.
I've actually stopped eating avocados because I can't find any that aren't from Mexico.
Oh, that is challenging. I agree.
And my understanding is that this massive appetite from the U.S. for avocados is driving deforestation in Mexico to plant avocados. And as much as I love them, I like forests better. So I'm not trying to guilt trip anybody into it. I think it's something that, in fact, I'd like to be wrong about this. And I haven't researched it in great detail at all. But from what I have heard, I'm like, well, that's enough for me to at least put a moratorium on my avocado consumption until I get around to figuring this out. So I drink a lot more avocado oil. Excuse me, olive oil. You're not doing unless the avocado oil is coming from a non-Mexico or non-rainforest source. And now, obviously, avocados are originally from rainforest. And David Wolf and I had a really interesting conversation about avocados, because that's his favorite food. It's his middle name, and so that's the third interview on day one of the Eat4 Earth event. And he was talking about how they're a pioneer species, and that actually enables us to grow them in more areas, as far as even arid areas. Like, they grow well in Southern California if you can get them started, and there's not much rainfall there. But so I think there's sort of a subtropical type, not like, typical equatorial tropical fruit. But so they have some flexibility, can live in somewhat arid areas. And anyway, so that's my concern about avocados, is that they might be such a celebrity fruit / we think of them as a vegetable, but they're a fruit, that they're possibly driving some loss of biodiversity in forests in Mexico.
And so, I do appreciate that knowledge. And while I probably won't stop eating avocados altogether, you're right. I'm going to be more conscious about making sure, especially my avocado oil, is not resourced in Mexico and so forth. And it's this is the thing that we get to vote every single day when we go buy food. When we go hunt and gather, we get to vote about the practices that the people we're buying the food from incorporate. And we're making a choice, and we're demanding from them what the quality is that we will pay for. And I get it. Listen, convenience is great. We live in 2021 in a Western culture, and convenience is awesome. And it's not as convenient all the time to have the knowledge that we have to eat properly. But we're also, as scientists, looking at the long-term effects of what we're doing from an agricultural and from a species perspective of survivability. And the more we limit our microbiome, the more we're concerned about the survivability and the lack, the strength of the organism.
Well, my ultimate vision for regenerative agriculture is that it's so there's another term out there that is agroecology, and I think that's a better term in a way, because what I would like to see regenerative agriculture become is ecosystem-based agriculture, where and it is, and that's essentially what it is, but it's kind of it's a spectrum, and it's not real well defined. People say, well, what is regenerative agriculture? And people are asking a good question, because how is it different from organic? Is it different from agroecology? And the key variables, I think, have to do with how closely does this system resemble an ecosystem, a functioning ecosystem. So in general, with agriculture, you've got a lot of monocropping and whether it's organic or conventional, we'll grow on one crop at a time. That's usually what's happening. Now, there are some organic practices that are sometimes used and sometimes not used in organic agriculture that make it more regenerative in the sense that it will, and regenerative has to do with improving soil health. So that's kind of the key undercurrent for regenerative agriculture is it's regenerating soil as opposed to gradually or rapidly depleting soil, which unfortunately a lot of organic agriculture is doing. A lot of organic agriculture, because they don't have access, they can't use the herbicides that they would normally use as a conventional farmer to control weeds. They use more tillage, which means plowing. So they're tearing up the soil more. So that can actually be worse overall for the soil health than herbicides. And
Mm.
that's kind of a shocking reality that tilling is that bad that it's potentially better for the system to use a little bit of herbicide. I don't like to say that at all. Um, and that's where some controversy arises in regenerative agriculture because there's people out there that are saying I'm regenerative because I'm doing this, this, and this, and this, but they're actually using some glyphosate. And it's like, ooh, you know, is that really necessary? And they're like, well, we're weaning off of it. We're getting there, but we haven't figured out how to eliminate it entirely. And I myself not being a farmer, I can't relate to how exactly, from a personal basis, how hard that might be to get there. It may or may not be hard, depending on the circumstances. And a lot of things anywhere, in any realm of life, a lot of things comes down to mindset. And if you have a will, you'll find the way. So I don't know how much of it is people just are kind of still leaning on it because they haven't decided. No matter what, I'll find a way to 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 make this work without glyphosate or whatever, even in the smallest amount. So, but I'm not passing judgment on anybody. I don't know. I am not a farmer. I can't pass judgment on that. But that's kind of the complexity that arises in this new world of regenerative agriculture. And so the spectrum is going from adding in cover crops, which now you're adding some biodiversity, and it's starting to look a little bit more like an ecosystem. And cover crops are simply, it's a mix typically of several to dozens even of species that you grow at the same time with the crop or in between, where you grow the crop and then you'll sow the cover crop. And having more, it's just like in your body when you have more plants coming in your mouth, you have more biodiversity developing in your gut. So when you have more plants growing in the soil, it's contributing to the biodiversity of the soil. All the soil organisms, you got the bacteria, the fungal organisms, the nematodes, which are like little tiny worms, microscopic worms, arthropods, which are kind of like insects, and microarthropods, and of course the insects, and this whole food web there. And the process of that food web becoming more and more diverse builds more and more complex carbon structures in the soil that can hold more minerals, that can hold more water, can hold more oxygen, and hold more carbon from the atmosphere. So that's where the impact on healing the planet comes in big time, is where we can draw down carbon. And so the one of the interviews in the Eat4 Earth event is with Walter Yena from Australia, and he's a brilliant guy, and he's put together a way of thinking about how the climate works. And it's not all about carbon dioxide. It's really more about water. But the key role of carbon is in soil. That's really, and the big problem with carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is more so that it raises the concentration of carbon dioxide in the ocean, which makes the ocean more acidic.
Hmm.
Because carbon dioxide is actually one of the weaker greenhouse gases. And so increasing carbon dioxide, it's hard to see how, when you really look at the whole picture of climate science, especially through the eyes of Walter Yena, and he's just talking straight out of Climate 101 textbooks. I mean, he's just saying, look, it's before they even started building models based on carbon dioxide, it was well known that water is the main greenhouse gas. And it was well known that the greenhouse effect was a very small part of climate dynamics. And the bigger part is the movement of water. And the movement of water is is going like this. It's this giant cycle through the soils. So you got the water coming out of the ocean. That's the big cycle. and then precipitating down into the on the landscapes and into the soil, and then getting transpired back up through plants and evaporated from water bodies like lakes and streams, getting back into the ocean, back into the atmosphere. And then the small water cycle is where this is happening over land masses. So you've got the evapotranspiration and evaporation from the soils through the plants and from the surfaces of water, bodies of water, and then moving over the continent and then raining down again. So you have these two cycles, and that's really what's actually pulling heat from the earth up into the atmosphere. Each time, molecule or set of molecules, a drop of water, rises up through a plant and evaporates in the atmosphere, it's pulling a certain amount of what they call latent heat. I think it's 592 something. I forget the actual measurement, into the atmosphere. When a rain event occurs, that molecule, that heat that's carried up into the clouds can actually escape into the upper atmosphere when there's precipitation. It creates sort of a window in the atmosphere for this heat to escape the planet. That's the major flux of heat back out into space. So you got heat coming in through the solar radiation, and then you got the heat going back out through these evaporation events. And I definitely recommend listening. I won't try to recap the whole conversation. I've already gone down the rabbit hole a little bit much. I want to bring it back to biodiversity, because that's really the key that holds all of this together, because you don't get carbon-rich soils without a certain degree of biodiversity. And you don't get high nutrient density without a certain degree of biodiversity in the soil, unless you're actively managing it with mineral inputs. People talk about, putting in rock dust and all this stuff. That's expensive and labor intensive and so forth, and it may not be necessary. It can be a real boost in the short term, but if you want to have really nutrient-rich food, if Elaine Ingham is right, and she's basically saying that there's enough minerals in any soil in the world for you to grow plants and nutrient-dense plants if you get the bacterial, well, I shouldn't just limit it to bacteria, but if you get the soil food web really functioning well. Now, there's some people that would contest that and would say that you have to more actively manage it if you're going for maximum mineral nutrient density in the foods that you're growing. So, but
that's so similar to our gut. Like, if your gut microbiome works well, which is where about 60 to 80% of your lymphatic channels are in your gut as well, then you're going to have the right microbiome. You're going to be able to digest your food, absorb your food, pull the crap out, leave in what you need, and move on. And it's a self-healing, self-generating mechanism. As long as I'm feeding it right, it'll move everything out, correct? I mean, this is what you're saying. Because the cover crops are not just adding to the soil, but I'm sure they're like attracting certain insects and providing, support for some of the other species of plants because they're feeding or pollinating or, different things like that. Like this woman who I have this local farm here, for those of you who live local, Quarry Hill Farm. And my son and I go there all the time. It's like our fun place to go to, just hang out with the animals and pick up our meat and our eggs and produce. And I think we counted at one point, she's got, 27 species of animals on her farm. And it's primarily chickens and eggs. But she has, some horses and some donkeys and sheep and goats. And, but she's got emus and she's got pheasants and she's got all sorts to create the best diversity for the chickens. So she creates the best eggs.
Mm-hmm.
It's all about her eggs. Her eggs are the best eggs I've ever had in my life. And but she's been farming this way for 20 years to create this ecosystem.
I'm really glad you brought up insects because, I kind of gave them short shrift or something by not mentioning them. They're so important, and having the plant biodiversity on a farm is really important to having the insect biodiversity. And, that's the pollinators and the predatory species that keep the pests, the so-called pests, under control. There's in the interview I did with Colin Seiss also from Down Under. He's a friend of Walter Yinna's, and he's developed a system called pasture cropping. And in pasture cropping, he's growing grains and he's raising animals and vegetables all at the same time. Now, the vegetables he's not actually harvesting for, as produce, but he could. But the sheep actually love the turnips. So the sheep are eating the turnips, and they're grazing. And he actually grazes the cattle and the sheep. I think he's also got cattle. I know he's got sheep because I've been there. I've seen them, and he's got like 4,000 sheep. But he will graze the grain to up to a certain point in their growth cycle, and from what I understand, it causes the, the plant to sort of bifurcate and have two heads instead of just one, two grain bearing heads on the plant. And so you actually get a more productive crop.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as you pull them off before they eat your grain. You have to pull the
Yeah,
animals off
right.
time. And so he's rotating them through different, pastures and so forth. But the other thing that's fascinating about this is, okay, so he tells the whole story about how his father started with intensive wheat cultivation, back in the 20s or 30s of, the last century. And you can see, he showed these pictures where the land was just devastated within a few years. It was already eroding and so forth. And they kept limping along with industrial inputs and so forth. And then there was a fire, and it wiped out their farm. I think it was in the 70s or 80s, and Colin was totally wiped out. It was, he inherited the farm and so forth, and he was doing what his father had been doing, but he was totally wiped out, and he had to figure out a way to farm without any kind of inputs because he couldn't afford anything anymore. And that's where he just thought, well, what if we just plant right into the stubble, a little bit of grass and so forth. And that's how they started with their pasture cropping. Is they just, instead of plowing up the whole field, they used like some kind of a drill to just to put a little hole and put the seed in it, cover it up. And it was, there's some kind of there's equipment for that, and I forget the name of it, but that's how pasture cropping got started, and it developed into this whole system where he's growing all kinds of different crops and raising animals, and the grasslands are coming back. So these seeds that have not germinated in, maybe a century are now germinating. So they were there, they were just waiting for good conditions. So now he actually has native grasslands growing on his property that hadn't been there for a very long time. And it's actually another crop that he can sell because people want the seeds so they can reintroduce native grasses on their land there in Australia for their livestock. And the seeds themselves can apparently, he thinks, or has it or knows, I'm not sure which, that it's a potential food source. So I don't know how good a food source this grass seed is, but it might be some kind of a human vegan superfood for all I know. I don't know if it's been commercialized yet. But this whole idea of pasture cropping is kind of bringing together what we normally expect from agriculture. A lot of people expect grain, right? I mean, I'm not a big fan of eating grain, but a lot of people do. And so you get that out of the system, plus you get animals, plus you get a natural ecosystem coming back where you have the actual grassland. So it's seasonal. So their grassland season, I think, is what we would consider their summer, which would be our winter. It might be just the opposite, and then during the other season, when it's dry, is when they plant it could have it backwards, but I think the dry season is when they actually plant their crops. And in the so-called wet season is when the grassland grows. I could be totally wrong about that part of it.
That's okay. But people get the concept that what they're doing is
restoring an ecosystem.
Right. Restoring. And that's what's so amazing. Like it's almost dead. And yet there's this tiny little flutter of life force in that soil, and they were able to regenerate that. Just like in the body, you can regenerate it when it's fed properly, when it's treated properly. And so how did this lead you to your nutrition and your health? Because you're obviously doing better now than you were in 13 years ago, 2007, I guess, when you saw that TED Talk.
I'm a little bit dehydrated right now, but I can totally tell I'm like super underhydrated. Well, one of the things that I brought into the Eat4 Earth event that relates to my own recovery was, I was very much addicted to having carbohydrates at every meal. And as a result of doing a ketogenic diet for a while, that really kind of liberated me from that, and it helped to fix my metabolism to a certain degree. So I included a whole day of talks about the ketogenic diet in the Eat4 Earth event. But I also have discovered since then that there's a lot of bioindividuality impacting whether a ketogenic diet is appropriate for a person. And there are even, times and cycles of life when it may or may not be as appropriate.
And eating ketogenic for a female is very different than eating ketogenic for a male.
Very much so, especially with the cycles. So
Yeah.
there are different parts of the cycle where it may work, and there's other parts of the cycle where it's probably going to be
Right.
unhealthy.
And ketosis is a naturally occurring biological mechanism in the body to allow your body to take out its own trash, essentially. And so, that's one great way to eat. But I think both of us would agree that there's no one diet that's perfect for everybody, and that eating a carnivore diet or a whole food 30 or a vegan diet or a vegetarian diet or all of that is good information. What would you say about that? Let me not put any words in your mouth. What would you say about all those different types of diets? The carnivore diet, the whole 30, the vegan, the vegetarian, the carnivore diet, the ketogenic diet, the low carb diet, the high fat diet, the Atkins diet. Am I missing any? A lot of fads out there.
Macrobiotics.
Oh, thank you. Macrobiotics, juicing, fruitarians.
Right. So I look at all of that through the lens of bioindividuality, and which has various facets. And one of them is genetics. One of them is epigenetics, because the conditions that your parents experienced, especially if there was famine, are going to create epigenetic changes that are passed down to the children, especially if it actually happened during pregnancy. So anything that happens during the second and third trimester of a woman's pregnancy is going to create some genetic epigenetic marks that will affect the excuse me the children. And genetics has a lot more to do with it than we thought, actually. So you hear a lot out there that, you know, genes load the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger, or environment pulls the trigger.
Right.
And that's true. It's very true. But the way to know where the triggers are is largely through the genes. So knowing your what they call single nucleotide polymorphisms. So we're learning that some people should not have a high fat diet, and some people can have a high fat diet. And I'm oversimplifying dramatically, but some people do not do real well with saturated fats, and some people do great with them. So if you just look at it, like if you don't break it down by the individual, you lose the trees. You know, you just have a forest. You're like, okay, looks like we can exonerate all saturated fats, because, you know, when you look at these population level studies and you separate out, you know, so basically there's different types of research, and they've done, you know, in the past they did a lot of epidemiological research, observational studies, where they just look at a whole population and they say, how do we think these people ate? How did they report that they ate? And then we see, you know, who got this disease and who didn't. Well, that conflates a whole lot of variables. And those studies tended to give the indication that maybe saturated fat was a problem. And then once we started doing better research, it pretty much totally exonerated saturated fat. But that's at a population level. That's not looking at individuals. When you start to look at the individual's genetics, you start to find out, okay, these people do fine, great with saturated fat, but these people, they don't do as well. And so there is a genetic factor in there.
And as you said, epigenetics, because, you know, a lot of this is in the emotional coding and in the epigenetic level of what's going on to bring on the emotional pieces that essentially translate into mechanisms in the body, causing you to create acids, even though you're eating the most alkaline diet, for instance. Or inflammation, you didn't even know you're eating an anti-inflammatory diet. Or maybe your genetics just creates inflammation just at the get-go because that's your marker. And so you're eating the most anti-inflammatory diet, yet you're showing up in your blood levels, you have inflammation, you can't figure it out. Well, then maybe you need to look at the genetic component.
Yeah, there's actually, there are genes that affect exactly that.
Yeah.
As far as whether somebody is prone to inflammation, and those people also tend to be prone to weight gain as a result. It's a very strong relationship between inflammation and weight gain. So, and that, there's the dietary component, there's the stress component, because chronic stress creates inflammation. And of course, there's the microbiome. Anytime the microbiome is damaged, you have a higher risk of having inflammation in the gut, which will become systemic inflammation, which will impact, insulin sensitivity versus insulin resistance. So it'll tend to promote insulin resistance. And so all that comes together as a, entire body burden, let's say, of inflammatory factors.
And I appreciate everybody sticking through. I know this has been a little bit longer podcast, but the bottom line is what Brendan is talking about, what he's done on Eat4 Earth, is paramount in us understanding and exciting, because so much of the media of the health information is like depressing. Like, oh my God, we live in a toxic bowl of soup and you're completely toxic and your genetics suck and every food out there is depleted. So good luck. Have a great life. It gets a little bit fatalistic and like, oh, there's no way out. And you're bringing to light that there is a way out, that we have the capacity with our knowledge and with the resources to help it all regenerate, to be supportive to both the earth and us.
Yeah, I want people to trade in the fear for fascination and fun.
Yes, I love it.
Because it is so fascinating.
It is so fascinating. I love talking to you. I feel like I'm hopeful that people aren't just bored with our scientific minds, but it is so fascinating what we are talking about. Like, it makes me want to not go farming, but go talk to people about this farming and get people to watch your Eat for Life event more and help promote this in any way I can. Eat for life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so did Zach Bush. He said that when I interviewed him. The first time I interviewed him. So yeah, if you go to
I'm channeling Dr. Zach Bush, because I totally believe in what Zach Bush says in many ways. Yeah, but it's true. Like, we need to learn how to get excited and fascinated about how we can make changes, rather than feeling like there's nothing we can do. We can't change anything. That's the way it is. The bees are dying. There's nothing we can do. There's plenty we can do. We just have to have awareness.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much more is possible for each of us as an individual and for us as a species, if we just get back to working with nature instead of against nature. And so if people will go and check out the Eat4 Earth event, you get free access for a while. If you go there, you just sign up, you get a period of free access, and get into some of those interviews. And I think you'll be inspired and lead to some new
paradigm shifts, some new excitement, some things to look forward to, and looking forward to changing in our world, so we can look for more. Like, I look forward to walking into a market, whatever that's going to look like in 20 years, and walking in and seeing non-rainforest only sourced avocados in multiple diversities from multiple places that all taste a little different. That's an exciting day.
Yeah, I would love, when I traveled in Latin America, it was so cool to see that there were so many different sizes and shapes of bananas. Yeah. And not that, I haven't looked into the sustainability of banana production in Central America, which is probably not very good, but any of these products can be produced in a sustainable way. So those little red ones, the little tiny red bananas, are so good. And they're just a little different, from the big, yellow bananas we're used to seeing. Same thing with avocados. It would just be awesome if we could just bring back the diversity and to have farms become ecosystems again. Because actually, this is what biotech doesn't want you to know. They don't want you to know that if you grow many species together in many layers in an ecosystem, you get far more food per unit of land. And that's partly why most of the food produced on this planet is produced by small independent farmers. It's not Monsanto and Bayer and whatever are going to feed the world. They're basically putting us on a fast track to wiping out our food supply, not just in biodiversity, but actually the productivity of it. Because they're there have been reports on this by the Union of Concerned Scientists where this goes back, I think, 10 years almost. They put out this report called Failure to Yield. And the GMO products, under certain circumstances, you get a minor yield gain, maybe. In other circumstances, it's either neutral or a loss. I mean, there's basically a wash as far as productivity. And but
Rodell Farm has a lot of that information if you're interested for that. Yep. Rodell Farm on their website has a ton of information about that. And there are 2 white papers as well that have come out. And their last white paper was just talking about the fact, which is a scientific study that basically just says that we can solve just exactly what Brendan is saying today. We can solve the problem of farming if we just literally all take a little farming home and create a little biodiversity and support our local farmers instead of the big suits.
Yeah, because those 70% of farmers, that 70% of food production is coming from 30% of the land, from people who have like 2 hectares or less. So it's because they're just producing way more food per unit of land, even though they don't have high tech and fertilizers and yada, yada. They've just got a little bit of biodiversity going. So.
Right. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. And I hope that everybody goes and checks out Eat4 Earth. And he's at free access for quite a while. So share it with your friends, get the word out there, let people know that this is out there. And do you have any other projects you're working on? Because this is like, you're tying this project up, or I don't know if this project's ever gonna be tied up, but it's a little more done. So what are you working on now?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to talk about in Eat4 Earth event, as I mentioned in this chat, is the fact that you can eat almost any diet and it can be regenerative for the planet and for your body if it's matched to your bio-individuality. So but the Eat4 Earth event didn't go as deep into that as I would have wanted. In fact, I've learned a lot since most of those interviews. And so I'm creating a program called Bio-Unique Blueprint. And it's like a soup to nuts exploration. It takes people through understanding their bio-individuality from, their genetic individuality, their metabolic individuality, nutritional individuality, circadian rhythm individuality. Individuality is too many syllables. I got to come up with a shorter word. But anyway, so all these different and psychological. And there's connections between certain genes and sort of personality traits, and how food interplays with that, and nutritional supplements, if somebody's using supplements to tweak things. But you got to do it with a knowledge of how your genes are going to respond to that. And the genes are basically determining the versions of enzymes that are running your body. And like Dr. Pizzorno says in my interview with him, I think it was my first interview with him in Eat4 Earth, he said, your body is an enzyme machine. And the enzyme, the spark plugs for the machines, all these little machines we call enzymes, are minerals. And that's why minerals are so important. So that's why that was such a big theme there. But as far as the enzymes that we produce, there's multiple variations of these enzymes. And that's determined by the particular version of a gene that you have for that enzyme. And so there's people who can have, that have enzymes. Most people have heard of MTHFR, and that affects their methylation enzymes. And so people that have certain variants of that enzyme, they're going to have a reduced efficiency in that enzyme. And that makes them more prone to methylation issues where they undermethylate. And that can be addressed by eating more greens or eating, organ meats or whatever it is that a person chooses to do. But it's also really important not to overdo it with supplements. It's ideal to do it with food, and supplements should be kind of a last resort. But if you're going to use them, you got to know, how much to take, and to know that it's not, more is better, and so forth. So you can get some insights into all of that by
this is why there's one, like vitamin C is great, but not everybody needs vitamin C. CoQ10 is great, but it doesn't mean everybody needs it. Vitamin D is great, but it doesn't mean everybody needs it. Like, I find that, and I'm sure you do too, that like people there's a lot of general information out there about what's good, what's bad, and things are good and bad. And it's just not like that in an ecosystem. It's all needed, all of it, and you've got to have the dark to enjoy the light, right? So it's like, if I don't eat a crappy, meal once in a while, I want to enjoy my good gourmet, organic, completely biodiverse meal, because that egg won't taste as good if I haven't had a commercial egg. her eggs will tend to taste not as good. And then all of a sudden I'll go back to her eggs and be like, oh, or we have this other farm here that has organic eggs. And sometimes if she's out, I'll go there. And they're completely different tastes. And I so appreciate the taste of her yolk and how each egg tastes a little differently. And they're each colored, the shells are differently. I go there and every egg tastes the same and I can't hardly eat them. But then I go back to hers and I'd like fall in love all over again, and it's important for people to realize that you are individualized and that your body has to be taken into account for where you are in your life, what you're doing, what your activity is, as well as your genetics, as well as all these other little bio-unique blueprints that you're going to be talking about. Very exciting. That is going to be fascinating and fun without fear, I have a feeling.
Exactly. Yeah. So, yeah, that's at biounique.com. Excuse me, biouniqueblueprint.com.
That's awesome. And so if somebody wants to reach out to you and wants to beyond Eat for Life, they can email you at brendan@eat4earth.org, correct? And
well, I'm not putting out a call for new people to interview for that.
Okay.
Certainly if somebody wants to get in touch, yeah, they feel free to get in touch. But it sounded like you were saying, as far as if you want to get on it, I didn't know what you meant by getting on it. Did you mean?
I meant if they want to find you or email you for some reason, sure. I'm sure you have your whole stage set for who you're interviewing. But it's more for if you want to access Brendan for the work he's doing and share, please, his Eat4Earth.org website and his event. And this is such monumental information. Thank you so much from myself, the scientific community, the biological community for doing this. It was so needed to understand how these two intertwine because, I concern myself with the human genome, but you're concerning yourself with the two of them together. And that is so incredibly important. Thank you so much for this work you're doing.
Oh, it's my pleasure. It's so much fun. And thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thank you all for sticking with us for the beats today. And I know you enjoyed it. So go get fascinated, have some more fun at the Eat4Earth.org, as well as his upcoming, is that called an event or a summit or a,
what Bio-Unique Blueprint?
Yeah. Is it
it's going to be actually a group coaching program.
Oh, okay. So look out for that. That's cool. A coaching program. That's very interesting. Excellent. Well, thank you all so much and keeping it real here on the Beats.